completely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Give her a thumbs up, maybe.
Yeah.
Somebody at the front, yeah, thumbs up.
Good, thank you. I can see in the chat you can hear me. Right, well, following on, I'm not going to talk about carbon at all. I'm going to talk about sustainability in the wider sense. We all know what the word means. We use it all the time. We don't always think about what it means, but in the context that I'm speaking, it's not jeopardizing the needs of future generations. And that's not just, as a landscape ecologist, that's not just people, that's also wildlife and the environment. So I'm involved with SIEM, Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, and it has a sub-strap line, if you like, championing a sustainable natural environment, which is great. And they declared, like many other organisations, they declared climate emergency and biodiversity crisis and actually made it into a call for action. So they set up the Action 2030 project, and the idea of this was that the professional body, as part of its role, would be providing members with tools and information to help them to address the emergency and the crisis in their professional work. So it was that what came out of that was, well, we need to have an advice note series on the use of sustainable materials in ecology and environmental management. And when I wrote the abstract for this presentation, I fully expected to be presenting you with where to find a lovely series of advice notes dealing with everything from outdoor clothing, PPE, with sustainability ratings for, you know, different wellies and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, this has not happened as quickly as intended, and they're still in draft form being completed. They will happen, and meanwhile, I'll tell you something about the journey. So the first thing that was done was a great idea. What we'll do is we'll survey the membership and ask them for their ideas. What we got was rather general responses, you know, predictably, but not actually providing with the tangible information that we wanted to put into advice notes. It's not terribly helpful to say, oh, you need to think about the carbon and energy that's been used in producing the materials you're using for your fieldwork. Yes, great idea, but that's an extra layer of work which people probably aren't going to be able to do. So working groups were set up on different aspects. There's a working group on PPE, there's a working group on reptiles and amphibians, etc. And they're doing their best to come up with ideas. Now, we know in our fieldwork with students, which is arguably different from the professional sphere, but it's still very interesting. We're not only constrained by our thoughts about sustainability, but also by our budgets. And quite a lot of what we do is already using materials. This is some of my students in a, well, we tend to call them bee homes, don't we? But it's a shelter for invertebrates, which we also get amphibians in. And reptile mats, again, tend to be different materials. And, sorry, and even with newt surveys, we're using plastic bottles, although obviously not using plastic bottles in the first place would be better. However, there are quite a lot of things that we can't put into the into the same category. This is Longworth traps. I'm sure you're familiar with these for small mammal work. Cost about £85 each. Made of metal, last for years, can be recycled. But when we're using these, we're also using plastic bags, polythene bags, which arguably we could use for a few times, but there are biosecurity issues associated with using them on different sites. So I don't know what alternative we can come up with for that. Dormouse boxes last for years, and we can use most of the ones available commercially are from FSC certified wood. So they do have that sustainability labelling, which is really helpful. Not so much the tubes, but nevertheless, they're long lasting. And when we're thinking about all of these things, we have to think about the cost, not just financial, but environmental, and weigh that up against the benefits. Bird ringing and bat ringing being an example. If we didn't do ringing with long-lasting rings, we wouldn't have the information on changing migration routes, etc. So it's quite a complicated topic. I'm very concerned generally about biosecurity and animal welfare in fieldwork, and I think this is an aspect of sustainability that perhaps isn't always thought of. If we ring a bird or a bat and it doesn't survive, as we know, it's very traumatic for the animal, then how does that affect sustainability in that wider sense? I think as ecologists, we should have an equivalent to the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors have to take, and we should be really mindful of the ethic of doing no harm. And that's not just to target animals, to the environment, but also in our purchasing habits, including fieldwork clothing. This is an ongoing conversation, as you can realise from the fact that we haven't actually finished any of these advice notes, and I'd be really pleased to hear any of your thoughts about this. And my email is on the final slide. It would be great if you put any comments in the chat. I'm sure we can collect the chat and feed into it. I do think these advice notes are a really good idea. You can imagine how popular I was in the professional body context when I said that actually all consultants, if a client approaches them, what they should be doing is referring them to their nearest competent ecologist, which is because we do have people travelling all over the country when there are people who could do the same work nearby. That's a stretch too far for most people, but I think we need to have a personal ethic there. And while I'm here, I've just, as I have very little to say on the advice notes, I'll just introduce the Academic Special Interest Group, which I was involved in setting up with Saeem. And here are the terms of reference, which you can read. I'm not going to read through them. Basically, I felt for a long time that greater links between professional bodies and those teaching would be hugely beneficial from both sides. We are actually, on our ecology-based courses, we're providing the basic material that goes into the profession and become members of the professional body. It's okay, I'm nearly there. We have discussion events on the third Thursday of every month. These are the ones coming up. Here are some past ones that we've had. Open to non-members, have to book through the Saeem website. And we also have an award for the higher education programme that is focusing on employability, well worth the promotional value of entering. And we also, just in case you have any student theses that you think are particularly good, or if you are a student and your thesis is particularly good, £250 is the award for the thesis, and the closing date is the 21st of November. I'll skip the bit about the consultation. I was just putting this in because I think it's great when the House of Lords recognises we need more skills in surveying, monitoring, etc. And I'll just put up my contact details. Thanks very much for listening. I do hope to hear from you about your ideas about the wider sustainability issues. Thanks very much. Have I kept to time? Just? No response from Trevor.
Yeah, okay. So, is it working? Anyone hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. So which one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, brilliant, thank you. So as I was saying, I'm preaching to the converted really in terms of the value of fieldwork. But really what Lesley and I were trying to find was a way that we could look at all of those great resources that we've created virtually and take that forward in terms of how we go about sharing all of that work that we've done and aiding best practice within the online virtual fieldwork. And also aspects of diversifying learning. So I think Helen touched on this a little bit about the collaborative side of really being able to enhance our fieldwork offering as a whole by perhaps partnering with institutions that might have access to resources that we don't have necessarily. And also as a way of supporting educators, so those that may not be as familiar with having those resources available to develop the online offering. So that's really the background of where we were coming from. And as I was preparing this talk, I thought I would look at that principle 2 that we've heard about this morning, and do a very quick survey of Russell Group universities by going into their website. It's a bit back of the envelope. May not be a true reflection, but I looked at what they were advertising on the websites as being their field offerings. And I was quite surprised, actually. I thought there would be more exotic locations, but the vast majority were UK and EU based. But then I also did the carbon footprint on the basis of anything that wasn't northern France or the UK would be a flight, and otherwise a coach. And I did a rough calculation of the carbon footprint of those. So you can see that even though there are few offerings to those far-flung destinations, they really are making up a large proportion of the carbon footprint of field trips overall. And also, just from my own experience, I've got some pictures here of a field trip that I led whilst at University of Gloucestershire in 2019. And again, that arms race for exotic field locations was really the driver behind this trip. And I have very much had mixed feelings about it, because although the students did learn some very valuable skills there, in reality, they probably were skills that they could have learned in the UK. And it was a little bit, as you can see from that top right picture, it really was a bit of a jolly at times, and not necessarily as targeted on the learning outcomes as I perhaps would have liked. And actually it brings up another point that Helen, I think you mentioned, that, or in the chat perhaps, even though these back of the envelope calculations I've done were very much targeted at environmental science courses and a bit of geography in there, when I looked at courses like the biology, they were going to many, many more exotic locations, and I guess kind of justifying it on that basis. So it's not the whole picture. And although it's easy to see it with those exotic locations and see the impact of it, both in terms of the carbon footprint and the ecologically sensitive locations, we still have issues within our UK field trips as well. So this is a site that Lesley and I go to with our first year students up in the Peak District every year. And just recently, we've had additional restrictions placed on us in being able to take our students there. And you can see some of the impacts. So this is an area in the Peak District that a lot of universities use. I see Simon and Linda on the call as well. And it is also an area that's used quite extensively by local schools. And you can see the impact both on the Google Earth image there, where you've got the footpaths with quite severe erosion, but also streamside, where we do the macroinvertebrate sampling. There's quite clear impacts of having large groups of students. So the point I'm trying to make is it's not just about those far-flung destinations. We do have these impacts that are UK based as well. I'm going to pass over to Lesley now.
Okay. All right, so hopefully you can still hear. Yeah, so what we've been doing to kind of try and tackle this is really to think about how we can use our digital offerings on field courses, that a lot of which we actually developed before COVID. So we actually we're already on the sort of digital side already, but how we could kind of use these to address some of these sustainability issues. So the aim of our kind of field trips online, we have a sort of multiple reasons why we've kind of created these, and some of you have seen me talk before, know that the primary reason that I started on the digital side was actually through inclusivity purposes. So this was about trying to allow students to not only access field courses if they couldn't get out there, but also to alleviate things like anxiety issues beforehand by allowing people to access the site before they actually got sort of dumped in the middle of the field. We also kind of are thinking now more about this sort of sustainability aspect. So, you know, can we kind of collaborate a little bit more and think about whether we need to access all of these sites or whether there is a more sustainable approach that we can have. So enhancing that collaboration, utilising our joint resources more, but also the education side. So how do we use these field trips online to aid students' understanding and students' learning, in addition to those on-site aspects. So this is where we kind of started. So this is the sort of stuff we were doing pre-COVID, and we used a tool called ThingLink, which I know many of you are familiar with. And what we did was creating these kind of virtual field courses. And again, these are sites that we actually go to. So it was that kind of preparation side. We started off quite simply. So you can see on the image there, the left-hand side, this is our kind of 360 images. So you can kind of look around the landscape and you'll see there are little kind of points in there, like little eyes and photo signs. And you can click on those and go into sort of specific bits of the site. So this was our quadrat studies, which is you know, I'm a botanist. So this is where an ecologist, botanist, whatever I fancy calling myself at the time. So this is our quadrat studies. So we had, yeah. So we had on the top right hand side, this is where we click through onto the quadrat. So this is a photo of a quadrat. And then you can see there are little points on there. So you click on those and it comes up with the plant that you're seeing at that point. And you can see that this just gives you actually the identification of the plant. So it's not really interactive. It's just kind of, here's a quadrat. You can look at what the plants are and gives you that ID. So this is where we started at. And what I wanted to do was to make this much more interactive so that people were getting much more sort of learning through these online field trips. So this is what we've done is, and I have to say, Sarah Davies in the room, we came down and we found that we were actually sort of thinking along the same lines, and she kind of already started creating one. So we've kind of we were inspired by them, I have to say. So what we've been doing is, and we worked with our technical guys at Birmingham, Joe Berry, to create this kind of framework. And the idea behind this is that this is a kind of framework that actually, seeing how things go, everybody could kind of use, because they could plug their stuff in and we could then actually share different field courses. So I'm hoping this is going to work. So I'm going to go to the link. Is that going to allow me to do that? It's just thinking about it. Can you?
Do that, yeah.
Sorry,
No,
I should have warned you that I was going to do that. Sorry, guys, we're just switching screens. Oh, yeah, but we had a delay. Oh, sorry, Derek. Was it?
Is this the one?
No, nope.
Okay. Are you able to access it? We happen to know the URL.
Was probably on.
That one?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll do a very. I've been told I've only got 2 minutes. So this is the kind of format. So we've got these kind of starting opening point, which is basically the overview of the site. And we can see that we've got things like a virtual tour, which is our ThingLink 360 images. We've got some drone footage, which we actually created from Google because we couldn't get permission to do the drones up there, but we've got the Google one, and we've got site maps. But the key thing is we've got a field guide, which allows us to, this is a work in progress, so it's definitely not finished, but we can put in almost like a kind of crib sheet of all the different species that the students might actually have there. So if we go into Calluna vulgaris, we can see that we've got a picture and we've got some information about habitat and all that sort of stuff. So the students can have a kind of field guide on the site. And then we also have activities that we can do. And that's not showing.
That's the verbiage you need.
It's which one? For the field site home.
Can you just go back to trip over.
Sorry, bear with me a minute.
Which is Burbage. Nearly there, nearly there. I'm going to try it.
Right, so we've got, this is Burbage Moor. So what we've got here is we've got the quadrats. So what we've got is me doing a video on what quadrats are and how to do them. And then we've got the site, and we can click on the quadrat and we can see it's the same sort of thing. But in this particular case, instead of it coming up with the name, it's just coming up with photos, and we can have multiple photos out there, and then students can use the field guide to try and identify. So we can actually have it a bit more interactive. So I need to swap again, Trev.
You stop presenting now, we'll bring the slide. Just make that as big as you can.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so I'll try and be sorry, Derek. So basically, it's quite a simple sort of framework. It's scalable, so we can put as many trips as we want on there, so we could share as much as we wanted, as many videos, all of that sort of stuff you can put in there as much as you want. All the tours and videos and things are hosted by external sites, so ThingLink or YouTube. So you've got those, so we can kind of use them in multiple ways, and you can make it much more interactive. Thank you. So, summary. This is our framework, and this is what we're kind of working on to try and share this. So we agree that the online fieldwork is not a substitute, it's an enhancement, and that's very much what we're trying to do. But it can be thought of as accessing remote and inaccessible locations that students might not be able to experience, or maybe we've stopped doing them because of sustainability issues. It provides equitable field experience for students because all of them can access it, can practice as much as they want on skills and things like that. It prevents damage to ecologically sensitive locations like Burbage that we've done, and potentially reduce carbon footprints. So the big question is, how do we do this? How do we go forward? How do we facilitate this resource sharing? Stopped.
Last session of the session, we may have time for one quick question.
Thanks, Derek. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm Tamara Hunt and the Sustainability Manager at the University of Chester. I was a geographer, so fully understand the value of fieldwork, but perhaps taking a slightly different look in this next presentation about how it fits into a wider institutional ambition and how we align fieldwork, sustainable travel and reducing our carbon footprint. There we go. So just want to share really and touch upon some of the motivations and the agendas that led to this project. So it was a cross-institutional project between the sustainability team, so my team, and the geography department, and we broadened it out to include students that were taking part in their work-based learning programme. So it really was about refining the value of fieldwork within our net zero agenda. We've got a net zero target for 2030. That doesn't include our business travel, but obviously our travel and transport is a key component. And so how can we start to, what we wanted to do really was baseline the carbon footprint of fieldwork. And then use this data to see how we could actually reduce that. So could we set targets for reducing our carbon footprint related to these departments' fieldwork activities, or could we look at alternate modes of travel for visiting existing sites? Whilst that was our kind of starting point, once we had the students working with us, it soon became clear that actually they managed to calculate the footprint quite quickly. So then we started to want to use that data and go beyond just having a baseline in terms of how we can use that to inform decision making for staff and students that are planning fieldwork. And finally, from my side of things, not only am I interested in reducing our carbon footprint, but also how can we embed sustainability skills within our curriculum? And again, particularly within how can we have those conversations within fieldwork? So we started out by looking and defining the value of fieldwork. I think there's a lot of the conversations already alluded this morning. There is an awful lot of value in being able to get out in the field, and our virtual or remote fieldwork can played a big part during COVID-19 pandemic in terms of still being able to access some of that and explore alternative environments. But there's something really that can only be achieved by being in the field. So how can we balance up achieving those learning outcomes as well as looking at sustainability? And I think I've mentioned it in the chat already this morning in that broader sense. So not just in terms of reducing the carbon, which is an important factor, but how that then impacts on the wider communities where we're taking those field trips in terms of the travel providers, the field courses, where are the supplies coming from food, students going out in the local bar or shops and spending money. So we need to look at it in that whole wider process. And so this really is then about looking, and from the department side of view, I know the geography department have signed up to the RGS principles. And so this was really focusing on how we deliver that. I think it was principle 2 that Helen mentioned earlier in terms of auditing and about getting students involved in that. And then just to give a bit of context in where that sits. So from my side of things, like I say, we have our net zero ambitions. The department had signed up to the RGS fieldwork principles, and we're trying to engage academics, students, staff in that kind of net zero sustainability journey. So we've run a whole host of programs over the years to try and engage staff and students. A lot of it's been a kind of tick box exercise, turning the lights off, printing double-sided. We wanted to start moving towards more meaningful projects that actually delivered results in terms of carbon reduction. So about a year ago, we started to roll out the carbon literacy training to staff and students. And a couple of the colleagues in geography attended that session. And as if you're familiar with the Carbon Literacy Project, at the end of the training and looking at the kind of impacts of climate change, the social injustices associated with it, attendees have to come up or complete an assessment detailing 2 projects which will reduce carbon emissions. So the geography team came up with one to look at and baseline the baseline the fieldwork footprint, and then come up with a way of reducing that. So, and had been collecting data for about 10 years. So a previous project that I was involved with about 10 years ago, they've been collating all of the data in terms of travel and transport modes that they've used, destinations, mileage, fuel that was used. So we had a whole wealth of data. So as part of that, we recruited 2 students. So all of our secondary students have to do a work placement for about 5 weeks. So we recruited 2. One was a geography student and one was an international relations and Chinese student. And they worked with us for those 5 weeks, crunching all of the data and working out the baseline footprint for each of the different field trips. And then the next step that we want to, which we're moving into, and I know Jane, who I've worked with on this project, has taken some students out on fieldwork along with Lucas, who did have these conversations during the field trip about the kind of role of travel and the impact that has. So what I'm not going to do is share with you kind of the total footprints for each of the different field trips, but the next step that the students took beyond that was to look at the alternative travel options available for the field trips. So I've got a selection here that kind of highlights some of the interesting factors that came up. So it's not always a case of being able to upgrade to a coach or to take the train, because some of these sites that we travel to are kind of remote. The train might be situated miles from your actual field site. So how are you actually going to get students, and particularly large groups of students, to that final destination? But when we started to look at the carbon emissions associated with different travel modes, what became clear was that there was a kind of threshold. So it got to a point where actually the train wasn't always more carbon efficient, which is perhaps something that we often kind of, you know, when I've been doing travel talks for around business travel to staff, we're concentrating on going, you know, you should take the train instead of flying, instead of driving. But actually there becomes a point that where you have a certain number of people that you need to move, that the train becomes less efficient, and actually in those instances either a minibus or coach becomes more efficient. So where am I looking at on this one? So the likes of Lamberis, and again we haven't included the train option there because the train doesn't get all the way there. So yeah, this is something that we're kind of working on and modelling going forward, and how we can use these to have conversations with students about why we're selecting certain sites and the travel options available. So some key findings, we're starting to pull some of that or explore some of that data in a bit more detail to look at when we use different forms of transport. So one of the key findings was that I think 42 was the key number of people, so staff and students on a field visit. So if you have less than 42 people on a trip, it becomes more efficient to travel by a minibus rather than a coach. But then again, that opens up a whole kind of complex conversation around depending which coach company you're with and the fuel efficiency of the vehicles that they're using and the number of seats that they're using. So in terms of the two companies that the department uses, one is more efficient when numbers hit over 53 students and staff attending, whereas the other is 42. So it needs to start a dialogue with the kind of transport providers that you're using to move staff and students to different sites. So and this is where I think we can start to build in and embed that sustainability skills, and it can then have those wider impacts, which is what we're trying to achieve with the carbon literacy training, is that it starts to impact students' thinking and then their professional and personal behaviour into the future. So having that broader remit as well, going beyond the learning outcomes of the field visit. It's also made, thanks Derek, got us starting to think about more local options. So can the learning outcomes for different fieldwork be achieved by not travelling as far? And looking at the, you know, does the actual location meet the learning outcomes that we're trying to retrieve? So moving forward, there's two kind of strands to this. One is the sustainability skills. So as I said, Jane's taking the field trip at the minute, and they're starting to embed and involve students in collating this data and having these discussions about the wider sustainability of fieldwork. And we are planning to have another group of work-based learning students to kind of take this project a little bit further and looking at how we implement that decision tree. And then finally, just to pick up on the conversations around partnership work, and I think that's quite key in working with local providers. So local authorities, local charities would be really keen to kind of work with you in aligning fieldwork and their ambitions. So one is we're looking at developing this decision tree, but one of the work-based learning students has gone on to start work on his dissertation with the Chester Zoo, and this work is also feed into wider biodiversity work that we're looking at in terms of improving the university estate and how we can better utilise that for learning and research. And that's me done, Derek. Thank you.
Right, can you? No, that's not going to work.
Can I just check if it can be heard now? There's no folks. Is sound back again?
Yeah, we can hear you
It's
online.
working now, yes.
That one? Can we go on?
Right, can you hear me now? There's Lesley Batty from Birmingham. Okay, I've totally forgotten what the question was.
Disciplinary style.
Yeah, disciplinary style. Yeah, so I think this is really important, and I think one of the things that we were thinking about, especially with this framework, is actually you can kind of easily translate this. So I could kind of see how you could kind of have things like geomorphological kind of structures on the website, you know, on the site, and have that kind of field guide to that kind of thing, or to, I don't know, fossils in earth, you know, in earth sciences, or sedimentary structures or things like that. So having a framework could potentially allow us to kind of collaborate more. And also then if we're doing something like environmental science, where students need to have a bit of earth sciences, a bit of bio, then you can kind of plug in different parts of it. And I think that would really kind of help. And certainly our kind of virtual tours that I put the link to, we've got bio in there, and earth sciences with the Iceland trip and all sorts of things. So I think we can break down those silos, but it's working out how do we share these resources and have a structure that actually works for multiple people, really. I guess that's what I suggest. Great, thanks, Lesley.
Just really quickly on that, I think it's fantastic. Sorry, what? Sorry, it's Helen Walkington, Oxford Brookes University. Thank you. Just to follow on from colleagues at Birmingham, I think their initiative is fantastic, and it's about not now having initiatives in the virtual world which are competitive and having a competitive attitude to that, but making sure that our virtual initiatives are shareable, are things that other people can use and add to, and keeping going with this kind of ethic of care and compassion across our different degree programs, courses, across international boundaries. And I think, and as a geographer, a spatial approach is really important, so that we can still identify with different places, and we need ways of sharing in that framework. So I think for some people, the skills training is a priority, so that people can do this, but also working out what platforms can support this work in a kind of non-competitive way, I think. Thank you.
On that note, it's Derek again. I think we'll stop for a comfort break, because it's now 11:31 or something, and we'll reconvene at 11:45. So thanks for putting up with the technological glitches this morning. We'll reconvene in about 15 minutes. Thank you.